All right, this is an idea I've been floating around for a few months, but in light of some recent releases, knife releases, some recent videos, some recent conversations I've had, I've decided to go ahead and make this video and kind of get into it. But first, let's start with what knife I'm carrying today, or in this case, knives. I'm carrying my Paramilitary 2 in Rex 45 and my Strider S&G, Ranger Green Scale, and Z-Wear Steel. So anyway, back to the video. What's the video about? This video, as you can see, there's a variety of knives. So this is not on a specific brand, a specific manufacturer, type of knife, etc. This is just purely about knives as a whole. So what we're talking about today is what flaws do you tolerate at what price point? So at what price point are you willing to accept a flaw here or there? And what price point do you think a knife needs to be near flawless? Now, obviously, these are man-made goods, so there's no such thing as a flawless knife. You can, if you nitpick, and I know a lot of the knife guys, maybe myself included, I've been accused of it. We can be a little bit nitpicky. So I'm going to start kind of left to right, and I've got a list here. Hopefully, I hit everything. If not, I might have to circle back around. But first thing is, let's talk about blade centering. So here I've got this Browning knife, and you can see the centering is off on this CRKT. You can see it's off in the opposite direction, and then this Souvenir knife here, you can see is off center as well. So centering is one of those issues that we often hear about in the knife community, and I know that people have differing opinions of this. Some of it related to price point, some of it related to functionality, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But that's one of the flaws that could possibly be talked about in when you're looking over a knife. Next up is this Slish buoy. And I'm going to talk about blade grind and or edge bevel grind. And you can see here, hopefully it comes across in the video, the bevel up here at the tip is, you know, fairly reasonable. But if you flip it over to the other side, you can see that that bevel is much wider. So if you see that there. Now that's something that I know drives some people crazy. This knife has been stropped, it has not been sharpened, so that is factory edge. But you know, the evenness of bevels I know is talked about a lot. One thing that Benchmade is criticized for a lot are actual primary grinds. So we're going to talk about the actual main grind of the blade. And on this particular knife, you can see a difference in the swedges here. You can see this swedge is much smaller than this wedge. This wedge is much wider. And if I remember correctly, this flat here is shorter than the flat here. You can see it's longer than the flat on this side. But again, you know, that's another flaw that we could talk about. So blade grind, primary grind, or the actual edge of the knife, the sharpened edge of the knife. Next up, and this seems to come up a lot with frame locks, but I also hear it a lot when I see people talking about Paramilitary 2s, especially when they're selling them. One of the first questions people want to know is, does your Paramilitary 2 have lock sticks? So if I fling this knife out, oh, it's not doing it today. If I fling it out, I think you heard it that time. You can hear it kind of sticks a little bit. Like I said, that's more of a frame lock thing, but you do hear a lot of people talking about lock stick. That's another thing that will kind of be taken into consideration with all of this stuff. Speaking of lock up, lock stick, or I'm sorry, not lock stick, lock up. Now this knife here, you can see has pretty early lockup. Now it can be early lockup, it can be late lockup, but the general there really is no general consensus, I guess I should say, because I know for a long time everybody wanted the earliest possible lockup that they can get. I know that during that same time period, and even now, some people prefer a later lockup. They feel like it's more stable, and some people want something somewhere in between. So that's another thing to kind of talk about and discuss when we're looking at flaws in knives or different types of fit and finishing knives than what we're willing to accept. poorly fitted, poor fit and finish. Now this is a 2013 Emerson Jungle Commander. So this is an earlier knife, but you can see here the scale does not fully meet up, or it actually is proud of this steel liner, and you can hear that my nail can catch the edge of that scale. Now it's the same thing if you look at the actual backspacer in comparison to the liners themselves. You can see there, I can catch my thumbnail there. Some people, that's another flaw to consider. The blade finish. Now, this is the one that I have that shows it the best, but you can see here that a lot of times when you get these Emersons, or at least in the past, when you get these Emersons, if it has a blade coating, some of it will be rubbed off in places. So sometimes you get a knife and it has flaws in the blade finish. Sometimes it's the actual blade grind itself. Now I don't have a blade with a grind issue, but you can see here the lines on the blade itself. Those come from the actual abrasive belts, and from time to time you can get an issue with the consistency of the finish, or if you've got a stone wash, sometimes there are flaws in the stone wash, so on and so forth. So that could be another issue, is the type of blade finish. Blade dullness. Now I want to kind of describe what I mean by dullness. This is a Banix 2 and CPM4 M4 steel, and this knife has had some use. You can see there on the blade that it has been used a little bit, but even when I got this knife from the factory, because I did buy this one new, the edge didn't feel sharp to me. Now, what do I mean sharp? Because sharp is one of those terms that everybody has a different perception of what's sharp and what is dull and what's kind of in between. When I say sharp, I want a knife that if I hold a piece of phone book paper, I can just slice right through it. Now, it doesn't have to be a push cut. Literally, I just want to be able to slice through it cleanly without it hanging up, tearing, stuttering, chattering, anything like that. I just want it to go through smoothly and easily. That's a sharp knife to me. This knife, even when I got it new, was not that level of sharpness. So sharpness is another thing to consider when we're talking about knives and flaws and things of that nature. Things that as soon as you buy them, you end up having to modify them. Think Glock. Think like, you know, the sights on the Glock. Most people will tell you as soon as you buy a Glock, you got to take the sights off. You got to replace them with something else because they're trash. A little bit similar to that is this example here. For whatever reason, people don't have any faith, or people have limited faith in these handle scales, and it's very common for people to buy this knife and swap the scales out immediately, almost doubling or sometimes doubling the cost of the knife, depending on the scales that you buy. So I know that there are other knives like the Paramilitary 3. And a lot of people will tell you the second you buy a Paramilitary 3, you have to take that clip off because the clip is garbage. It sticks out of your pocket too much, so on and so forth. You need an aftermarket clip. So that's going to set you back between $15 and $20 some odd dollars, $15 and $25 or so, as soon as you buy the knife. So those are a couple of examples of knives that as soon as you buy it, there's something on it that either you feel needs to be fixed, or a general consensus amongst the community is it needs to be fixed. Next up would be poor action and detent. So a lot of times, I'll pick up the Emerson again. A lot of times people will talk about the action of like an Emerson, and they'll say, oh man, it's so gritty, it's so jerky, it's so, you know, it's awful. When we buy a knife, some people like knives that when you release the lock bar, they shake down and they're drop free. Other people like a more hydraulic feeling, and very few people want anything that feels like it has sand and dirt and grit and grime in the pivot, and you really just are fighting the action of the knife. Now, as you can see, this one is not like that, but that is one of the things, and this knife is not nearly as smooth as something like this knife here. That's what a lot of people like. They want a very smooth, free, clean action. So how's the action of the knife? That's another flaw. Also, detent. So if we have a knife when I shake it, does the knife come out of the blade well? So if I shake the knife, is it going to come out of the blade well, or does it stay retained? That's another thing that comes up from time to time. So all of those are things to consider, flaws or defects or things to take into consideration when you're going to buy a knife. Now, I'm sure there are more. I didn't pull out a traditional knife. I meant to, but I'm not going to stop the video to go run and get one. A lot of these things can apply to traditional knives, so please feel free to chime in down below if you have some things you want to talk about with traditional knives as well. Matter of fact, I'll talk about a few of them with this lockback right here. With this lockback, this is a more traditional design, and you can see here how that actually locks up. And a lot of lockbacks have play up and down, and I don't know if you'll be able to hear it, but this one does have some play up and down. So is that acceptable? And at what price is it not acceptable? Do you not buy lockbacks because of that issue? Is there any side-to-side blade play, which again could be in any of these as well? Is there any side-to-side blade play? Any up and down, again applying to all of these knives. So that's another thing, not exclusive to traditionals, but I use that as an example since that's the closest thing I have to a traditional knife on the table. Now, what price points do I accept? What flaws? This is my personal list, and this is where I'd like to hear from you guys. So I've got a little breakdown here. From $50 to $100, I'm willing to accept some minor issues, some slight off-centeredness, maybe if the scales don't exactly line up, maybe some, just a little bit of one or two of the things that I talked about in almost any category, as long as the knife is functional. As long as it's functional and it's got a few flaws, I'm okay. I can live with it. From $100 to $200, well, really $100 to $300 is what I'm going to call it. I really want something that has very minimal flaws, and I really want those flaws to be something that I can fix myself. I want it to be something like an issue with how sharp the blade is. Something I can just sharpen the knife up, put it right into action, and there are no issues. I don't really want a lot of issues with a knife that is in that $100 to $300 range at all. And once I step up to the $400+ range, I really don't want any issues. And that's a tricky area once you get to the $400 range, because you're really getting into, and I know this is a complicated area, or people have made it complicated, the custom, mid-tech, high-end production, conflated area of knives. Once you hit $400, you're kind of in that ballpark of where you could be touching any of those knives, however you want to look at it. And I think that once you hit that tier of knives, there should be little to no issues. Now, one of the things you'll find in knives at that level that have tighter tolerances is that you may get a knife that it may be a little bit stiff. Now, a lot of times those knives will break in. It's just that the tolerances are so tight because the knife is so well put together, it needs some time to break in. Kind of think of like a 1911. And I know I'm using a lot of gun analogies in this video, but that's the first thing that came to my mind. So that's my breakdown, pretty much from the $50 to $100 range. I'm willing to accept, one or two of the things that I talked about. Hopefully most of them are fixable and I can get it fixed. From the $100 to $300 price range, I want something that is fixable, and I don't really want more than one flaw, and it needs to be something that I can fix myself without having to send it in. And $400 plus, it needs to be pretty much perfect, as close to perfect as it could possibly be. I'd like to hear what you guys have to say. Please comment down below. I appreciate you guys watching, and remember, a lazy man carries a dull knife.